Oh, never mind.
Hello. All right. So today we are covering the early Republic handout. In it, the first three or four, we're doing great man history. Remember, great man history does not imply necessarily that the people that you are studying are morally great people. All it implies is that concerning your subjective take on causation, you believe that one of the surefire ways of figuring out why things turn the way they did is to study those in power, in great positions of power. So hence, in American history with our republic, you look at our presidents and their administrations, you look at their personalities, try to discern possible motives, etc., and trying to understand why things went down the way they did at that time. It's kind of an archaic form of historiography. A lot of historians have moved on from that. Quite often, I like to believe in my class, I employ structural history as an alternative. Structural history implies that history and life are much bigger than any individual or group of individuals for that matter, and that that which causes the wheels of history to turn in the direction in which they do are nameless large forces. So like culture, the economy, etc. So I like to think that I employ that elsewhere. This is with the exception of Abraham Lincoln at the end of the semester, about the only time that I do that. I have not, Deshan. I am very sorry. I am in need of catching up. All right. I'm very sorry, but I will. Okay. I will soon. Okay. I promise. I apologize for that. Obviously, if you're having issues, especially like with the Constitution one, which was different and that which I was asking you, I always make exceptions. I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt that you really tried to do it. You didn't understand exactly that which was expected of you, etc. And I won't mark down as late your assignment if you still need to redo it and turn it in. Okay, so keep that in mind. I will make up for missing on your messages by taking it easy on you with your grade. All right, because I'm aware that I should be better in that department. All right, so what I want to do is yeah, and then also catch up on your grades, for crying out loud. I'm so sorry. All right, and so I will be doing that. I will be on my responsibility of getting my wife to help me with the whatchamacallit, the oh shoot, the posting these Zoom videos. Okay, now this is going to be difficult. What I need to do is I don't know how to bypass. There we go. Okay. There we go. Thank goodness. Okay, hopefully everyone can see this. Just one more thing. I have an in-class course in the mornings, and I forgot my thumb drive. So I noticed this is the digital exact assignment itself on Canvas rather than my version on a thumb drive, in which I usually use. So hopefully it's not going to afford me less flexibility in moving around and highlighting things. Okay, and so please keep that in mind. Thank you for your patience and your perseverance in this class, especially one that moves so quickly with pace. We have an assignment like every other day that has to be done. All right, and so I promise I will keep that in mind. I'm about halfway through the first assignment, and I know that's pitiful, but those that I've covered were very well done. I find myself writing the same things about that which I liked about them, and that which I liked was very standard. It was right up to my subjective expectations. All right, the analysis is not much different from a summary. You just show me that you've discerned what the thesis is of that section, the main manner by which it was defended, a couple supporting key facts, logic, pathos, etc. And then your evaluation is all your own. Why you do, or but I hope you defend it, why you do or do not find the piece to be very credible. Okay. So at any rate, going on to this one, we do the first three administrations, all right, with George Washington and John Adams and then Thomas Jefferson. And we'll go over some of the main, administrative acts by Congress of that time, cabinet decisions, etc., that are often found in the history books. And we have them in an argumentative format. All right. Number one is not, it's kind of like the Articles of Confederation thesis. It's pretty boring. It's pretty old. It's almost become monolithic, which I don't like. I'd like someone to come up with a cutting edge thesis that is deeper, that, gives nuance to this, challenges it in any ways, etc. But here it is nevertheless, okay? It's the standard one to know with US history students. And that is that the perceived excesses of Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of Treasury provoked an oppositional liberal party and thus caused the formation of a two-party system. And it's really that simple. But notice my little take on it is the perceived part. Is I'd like to think that Alexander Hamilton was not as uber conservative as the liberals painted him out to be, or even possibly as much as they genuinely believed him to be. All right. And a couple of reasons why is like, you look on a relative basis in Latin America, you had guys on the right, like Agustin de Iturbide, Anastasio Bustamante. These guys spoke about having an emperor. They spoke about having a landed church that has privileges, one established church. Those are old school ideas, right? And institutions. They wanted a landed aristocracy. Okay, so a group of people that literally just by their bloodline were entitled to certain opportunities and political powers that others were not open to. They wanted to highly restrict the franchise, restrict who was entitled to citizenship rights, who could even vote. They wanted a very small number of elected offices. They wanted many positions, including regional governors, to be handpicked by the chief executive of the country instead of elected, as in like English tradition or American tradition right after the War for Independence. So at any rate, they were genuinely pretty far to the right. Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, he was an abolitionist against slavery. He wanted our republic. I mean, my goodness, he wrote many of the Federalist Papers in support of this new federal republic. So he wanted a balance in the spirit of Montesquieu of the Enlightenment, with checks and balances, some elected offices, some appointed offices, restricts and checks on one another, etc. He wanted that. So he was not for a landed aristocracy. He was not for the all, powerful executive over the country. He didn't want an established church. He wasn't real big on a standing army. A lot of things that those on the uber right were. And then conversely, on the left, you have people like Francisco de Miranda and others in Latin America who wanted land redistribution, to redistribute land from the rich to the poor. You had people like Miguel Hidalgo, who wanted almost like an early form of syndicalism, of like democratic Marxism, whereby the people of each village and town and region, they owned the means of production collectively and democratically. They decided on the allocation of resources. They democratically made all their decisions almost sovereignly. That's pretty far to the left. They wanted universal citizenship, but sorry, ladies, not for ladies yet, but for all men of all colors. You're talking about, a lot more leftist in Latin America. You look at our left, like with Thomas Jefferson, that guy kept his slaves and was very selective in how he opposed slavery on principle, and very, almost unequivocally cowardly in dealing with slavery practically in his own life. He too thought that the masses who were presently not very well educated would often make the same mistakes that Plato and Aristotle and the old critics of democracy contended, that they would make a lot of emotional decisions, irrational decisions, decisions that were undergirded by their coveting of the wealth's land and money, and them wanting to get a piece of that. So he foresaw that democracy in and of itself, he too believed that it could be very detrimental to a society. And he too was for checks and balances and some offices being appointed rather than elected for a, quote, better sort, at least in the time being, to be trusted as stewards of the power. So in many ways, and he sure as heck wasn't for land redistribution. He wasn't willing to give up a single acre of Monticello, his home plantation, for a slave or any common white citizen. No one made a really strong, including on the left, case for universal citizenship. And so my argument is that our political spectrum relative to other countries and other regions of the world in historical times, I think was relatively narrow. I really do. I don't think the conservatives were that conservative. I don't think the liberals were that liberal. And I think oftentimes when they ran for office, they engaged, as so often happens, in hyperbole, right? In deliberate strategic exaggeration to try to scare the voters away from voting for their opponent. So keep that in mind, but that's just my take. But I feel like I said, I feel like I could defend it. But that is just my take. And so with me, with Alexander Hamilton, it was the perception more than anything. Like I said, I think he gets a little bit of a bad rap for being them exaggerating how conservative he was, but it almost didn't matter when he was perceived as such. And people really grew to believe he had become excessively kind of archaic, going back old school, going back to the past. So at any rate, how did he do that? Well, for one, right, is it was in vogue at that time to be deist, D-E-I-S-T. And deists during the Enlightenment believed that God was like a great clockmaker who made everything by natural laws that are discernible mathematically, logically, scientifically, and everything is rational and is to make sense, right? And so the Wealth and Poverty of Nations book by Adam Smith was a product of that environment, of his zeitgeist, of the spirit of his age. So at any rate, he believed that there were powers galore out there, natural ones, that would keep a free, open capitalist economy in check. One that I recall from reading decades ago that is, a little bit questionable to some people is the fact of reputation. That business owners, et cetera, and employers in particular, will not pay their workers too poorly, will not charge too high of prices, et cetera, because they will be jealous of their own reputation, and they won't want to develop a reputation as a miser, an oppressor, et cetera. And so, Alexander Hamilton comes out and says, no, we're not adhering fully to the Enlightenment, to the deistic worldview, and to Adam Smith's book. We're not going to be a laissez-faire capitalist economic society. Laissez-faire, I guess, just means let it be, right? Where the government just literally lets things happen naturally in the free competition and enterprise of the economic world. So instead, right, he wants the government to help create America into an economic giant. Okay, well, how do you do that? Well, for one, right, is he stated that we can't be indebted. We can't continue to be indebted. The states during the Articles of Confederation and before that during the War for Independence, as well as the federal government, were highly in debt to lenders, to creditors from Europe, etc., and here. And, he was very practical in that way. And he said that, they're not going to continue, indefinitely to lend those governments money if they're never paid back. So he says, first of all, we got to clean the slate. We got to find a way to eventually pay off our debts. So he says the federal government ought to take control of the state's debts and begin a policy of paying those debts back. Now, you think like a good libertarian, right? You are to be wary of any federal government intervention in your state's affairs, your region, your local area's affairs. So, okay, they want to do this good deed for us today, right? But if the government reaches its hands into our budget and to, our discretionary budget and all that, what are they going to do tomorrow with that power? So if you think like a good libertarian, that will make you wary. That'll make you very, suspicious. But nevertheless, he pushed forward. He cut a deal with Thomas Jefferson at a famous dinner table, and he was given the green light by George Washington. So he begins trying a process of taking over all the state's debts, right? In addition to that, another source of money coming out was subsidization. That's just a fancy word for the government helping out certain industries, okay? And the rationale is that, let's say, for instance, if we fast forward with infrastructure, right, with transportation and communication, kind of the skeletal foundations of an economy, connecting, raw resources to a factory, that factory to a market where it's sold, etc., and one market to another, etc. The idea is theoretically, those who have some capital, some money to play with, as a business, they're going to find the surest, easiest, quickest route to profit, period. So oftentimes they're going to find the same types of industries. So for instance, one industry that seemed to go well in that regard and took off as our first major industry was textiles, clothing. So at any rate, we can't have everybody doing that, said Alexander Hamilton. We have to give some people the incentive to pay more now and wait to start accruing profits till later. And again, I think of an example of railroads, right? They got to pay for the iron and later steel rails. They got to pay for the land that they're traversing. They have to pay for the laborers, the machines, the machine tools, those who keep up the machines, etc. So they have to pay all this money out before they get a cent of revenue, all that in overhead, right? So he said, certain industries are vital for the whole country, right? That you could say with some commodities, etc., that what is good for them is good for the whole country. And again, not to be repetitive, but they will say that about the railroads, that the railroads will benefit a myriad of different demographics of Americans and a myriad facets of the economy, etc. So if he and the Treasury Department decide that you are beginning to dabble in an industry that is highly needed for the country's well-being, they will help you out. They'll meet you halfway. So there are a myriad of ways in which they could do that. They could grant land to you for free. They could sell bonds to you. And remember, bonds are just loans that you pay them back with interest. They can, there's just all kinds of ways they could subsidize you. So that's exactly what he wanted to do, because he wanted us not only to develop an infrastructure with transportation, communication, etc., but he wanted us to diversify. He thought that was best for the country in the long run, that we should not be at the mercy economically of certain commodities and goods and products from Europe in particular, other countries, that we should be able to develop everything we need here in the US. So if you began to start a new industry, something novel to the US economy, you might be open to be subsidized by the federal government. So that was another way in which he wanted to spend money. So how does he get this money, right? Well, for one, and then another way in which he helped the entrepreneurs out is he was for protective tariffs, because see the Belgian and like Belgium and Flanders and other places of Europe, they were ahead of us in textiles, for instance. So they could outproduce us with their steam powered machinery, and they could develop a higher grade clothing product, and with a much greater quantity, they could kind of pull a Walmart on you, and they could undersell you. They could put a lower price on their product than you can. Because if you're in a small burgeoning business and you crunch the numbers of your overhead that you have to pay out before even profit comes in, you could only go so low on your price before you go out of business. So the big guys can afford to undersell you. And of course, we're going to find that out very flagrantly during the second industrial revolution of your next US history class with the robber barons like Rockefeller and Carnegie and stuff. But at any rate, we're nowhere near there at this point. But some people in Europe are heading in that direction ahead of us. So in order to get Americans to buy American-made products instead of European-made products, and give revenue to our American companies so that they can begin to blossom, they put artificial tariffs on the prices of imported cloth and other commodities, so that Americans would buy American products instead. So that clearly is not laissez-faire, right? That's the government helping them out. So at any rate, you go backwards, right? Or you think of, okay, image-wise, who is he seen to be helping? Who seems, what type of demographic tends to have his attention, his help, etc. It's largely the powerful leaders of the northern bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie just means people of the city. So mainly we're talking about the big entrepreneurs, the beginnings of, by the 1840s, they will develop corporate forms of organization. These are like the early pre-corporations. So he's helping them out. They're the ones who were establishing new industries, industries that are deemed desirable for the whole country, receiving the import tariffs against their competitors in Europe, etc. Then in addition to that, right, one of the ways by which he wants to get the money to come in is through bond certificates. And so the government sold bond certificates and encouraged the businesses to incorporate and sell bond certificates as well. Well, who has money, discretionary money on the side to lend to the government or to lend to these corporations, these pre-corporations, and expect, to get interest back on that loan? Those who are already wealthy, the creditor class. So again, he's getting from and he's helping the well-to-do businessmen in the country, and it's that is not lost on the rest of the country. He's creating a very negative image. But to him, right, this is all practically oriented into making us into an economic giant. All right. So then if that's not controversial enough, he begins making decisions as the Secretary of Treasury to tax certain commodities to raise revenue for the federal government. Remember, the Constitution says all taxes, all legislation for taxes shall emanate from the House of Representatives. Remember, we so vocally reiterated during the War for Independence, no taxation but by representation, right? And he hasn't been elected into office. He's handpicked by the president and approved by the unelected Senate. So that was ironic. And by the way, he also put a tax on tea, ironically, from their memory of the English. So at any rate, you had distillers of whiskey, and supposedly that had become a shortcut from the smaller scale distillers toward their American dream. Is already in the early 1800s, You're going to get the beginnings of the mechanical reaper, thresher, harvester, combine, and this kind of, agricultural machinery. But even before that, here, just before it, the big business farmers could outproduce their smaller competitors. They had more collateral to start with, bought more land, hired more workers, had the best tools and instruments, etc., had the best connections to markets. So at any rate, those who could not vie with the big wheat farmers decided it was cheaper, quicker, and easier to distill that wheat into whiskey. And that's how they were making their money. So he puts a tax on whiskey, and they were furious, right? And so at any rate, they formed a whiskey rebellion. They refused to pay the tax. They began to arm themselves, etc. And, liberals had the ear of George Washington as well as conservatives in his cabinet. And they told him, this is symbolic. The world is watching. Yes, we had Shays' Rebellion during the Articles of Confederation that demonstrated how weak the Confederation was. But it hasn't been that long since we broke away from Mother England. Do we really want to send our own troops against our own men? And Washington made the conservative decision. Yes, we do. We have to make a statement that uprisings like Shays' Rebellion from just years earlier will no longer be tolerated under this new republic. So they raised an army larger than the Continental Army ever was to squash this American whiskey rebellion. And they basically scattered when this collected army that conscripted state militiamen came to squash them. They backed down at the last minute. But it was scary to a lot of liberals. Like, wow, George Washington's turning his own armed forces against his own men. So at any rate, you go to Washington. Washington is trying to play the middle. He plays the part of like the indifferent father who hates to see his liberal and conservative sons fight with one another. He was all about like Cicero and Tacitus of Rome, civic virtue. Don't think about what your own faction wants. If you're a businessman, if you're a cash crop farmer, if you're an industrial laborer, don't just vote and go for what your group wants, your faction, but instead think what's best for the whole country. So he hated the idea of partisanship, of people putting their own faction, including not only your own self-interest, but a faction also is a group that has the same ideology, putting it ahead of everything else. He hated that idea. But nevertheless, it happens underneath his presidency in his 2 terms. So there's evidence that he tried to play the middle. You look at his cabinet, it was relatively balanced between liberals and conservatives. It was relatively balanced between Southerners and Northerners or Yankees. He went on goodwill tours. He took 2 o'clock walks and opened himself up to the public to shake hands and speak with people. He established news presses where he'd speak to the press leaders and answer questions, etc. He did things to try to placate the liberals, to show that he was not going to be a tyrannical, aloof president as if he were king. So he tried to do such things. There was a hostile press. There was a guy named Philip Freneau who wrote very ill of him and of his administration. And he had more than one conservative in his cabinet tell him he ought to shut down Philip Freneau's press and have him arrested. And Washington, thankfully, said, no, that's ridiculous. And it's unconstitutional. They have a freedom of press. And so he did those things to try to placate the liberals. But with the conservatives, right, he put the conservative Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of Treasury, and he gave them this long leash to do all this stuff that gave himself and Washington's administration a negative image of being a bit of a kind of a plutocracy. Remember, a plutocracy is when the government is in the pockets of the rich and they're allies with each other. with the same interests, etc., oftentimes at the expense of everyone else, politically and economically. So if that were not bad enough, Hamilton establishes a bank. Now notice in Article 1, Section 8 under Congress, notice he's in the executive, in the cabinet. Notice Article 2, the president, nothing is said of a national bank. So the Supreme Court tries it, right? And what do you know? His lawyers used the necessary and proper clause, right? Saying at the bottom of Article 1, Section 8, Congress and the federal government shall also do that which is necessary and proper connected to the aforementioned powers that they've been given. So they connected it to regulating interstate trade, paying off the debt, etc. And so with the conservative choices in the Supreme Court made by George Washington, the Supreme Court okayed it. And so now, and note also that there was a national bank tied to big businesses under England, right? And so this all looked all too British, all too conservative, all too plutocratic, etc. So you have James Madison, who wrote most of the conservative Constitution with his own pen. And he is literally going to switch sides. He is going to ally himself with Thomas Jefferson, and they're going to start a writing campaign, a political campaign, etc., against particularly Alexander Hamilton and the administration as having violated the spirit of 76. In 1776, right, in the Declaration of Independence, you have the social contract enumerated right away. All these kind of enlightened tenets are put into that document. So they're saying, right, that this first administration is it's reversing the revolution, if you believe it was a revolution, right? So at any rate, a political oppositional party formed in the form of the Democratic Republicans, and thus began our two-party system. All right. So are there any questions on that one? Hamilton's perceived excessive conservatism backfired and created an oppositional second party. Very old thesis, but there it is. All right, David McCullough on President John Adams being this first, as the second president, the first single-term president who lost re-election. This is, I'll say it right away, in my estimation, reading this book, this is court history. At least something akin to it. This guy likes John Adams. He empathizes with John Adams. So how in the world is he going to do that? Paint him in a positive light in light of his failure to win re-election? Well, it's very simple, as he contends that in order to be successful and remain successful as a politician, right, you have to play the game. You have to embrace your party's complete platform. You have to stay loyal to it, even if you disagree with some of its tenets, in order to maintain the loyalty of your partisans, of those in your own party. All right. And he says that John Adams was too independent-minded. He dared to have a mind of his own. He dared to have a conscience of his own. So what did he do in doing such and thinking for himself? He alienated himself from both sides. He made enemies on both sides. So, for instance, the opposition. John Adams kind of does, when you look at some of his quotes, and again, this is me, I want to qualify it, okay? But I personally interpret reading stuff from him, especially primary source quotes directly from him, is I almost think he enjoyed political fighting and that he almost didn't mind wanting to be interpreted as more conservative than he really was. So, for instance, in his debates with Thomas Jefferson, at one time he said basically the masses are asses. He said he was more worried about tyranny of the majority and excess democracy than he was by any kind of tyranny by a group of a few aristocratic leaders. So he spoke about, like I said, the old Plato and Aristotle caricatures of the common uneducated people, led by emotion, selfishly wanting the wealth of the wealthy, rash decisions, etc. Right? So he made no desire to remotely hide that, and so he came across right away as a man who had airs, who thought he was too good for his own common people. All right. The French Revolution occurred, and to a lot of poor Americans, supposedly, and to some liberals, like Thomas Jefferson traveled to France and he helped write the Declaration and Rights of Man. When just at the beginning, before the Jacobins took the French Revolution into its most radical phase. When the Jacobins took over and they began political executions of those formerly in power, he had a very callous quote whereby, I'm going to butcher this in my paraphrase, but whereby he said, you know, the tree of liberty needs to be nurtured with the blood of rebels and tyrants from time to time. That sometimes, just to make sure that the human heart of society is beating and doesn't stop, that it's good to have people that are rising up in rebellion, fighting for liberty, fighting for their rights, even if they got to kill some leaders, etc. And of course, that frightened the heck out of the conservatives like John Adams when Thomas Jefferson stated that. But when the Jacobins took over from the Gironde in the French Revolution, their attack, it crossed some lines, right? So for one, Europe has not had much of a stomach for land and property redistribution, and the Jacobins did. Okay. At one point, you were deemed a criminal through these kangaroo trials. And a kangaroo trial, right, is that everyone knows you're going to be declared guilty before it even begins. They're just going through a formality of putting you through the trial. There were quite a few kangaroo trials of Frenchmen who lost their lives and property only because they were chevalier. They were high-ranking nobility, and that was their only crime. Okay, but of course they said that they in their bloodline had been guilty of oppression of the common French people for centuries, and so that was kind of crossing the line to some people when they began mass executions. Then they also crossed the line when they attacked the Catholic Church. They killed high-ranking clergymen. They had some of them executed. They confiscated church property. They took French education out of the hands of the clergy. They even redid the Cathedral of Notre Dame and turned it into the palace of the goddess Athena, right? The goddess of virtue and wisdom. And they even declared the end to the old, what was it, the Julian or Gregorian calendar of the Catholic Church, and declared year one of reason. So they were institutionally against the power and the excesses of the Catholic Church, but also ideologically against Christianity. So at that point, right, John Adams was one of the most vocal Christian presidents we've ever had. So John Adams had made the decision and publicly espoused that he thought the French Revolution had become nothing short of demonic, of the devil. So the French Revolution occurs, and You have the power vacuum after Danton and Robespierre are killed, the leaders. And then Napoleon steps in, right? And he institutes, ironically, a tyrannical form of enlightenment. That's a weird juxtaposition. But his Napoleonic code was rather enlightened. It gave women a lot of rights. It gave the common people a lot of rights and economic opportunities. It was very, in some ways, by modern standards, very modern. But it was, of course, with an autocratic leader who retaliated with the invention of Prussia and Austria to try to save Louis XVI on more than one occasion. He declared war against them and began fighting with his neighbors of Europe, right? And he was contending that he was going to, by force, spread the French Revolution to these other countries and liberate their people under his Napoleonic code. So at any rate, you had the development of at least hundreds, if not thousands, of pro-French Revolution and then subsequently even pro-Napoleon social and political clubs throughout the country that raised money for the cause. Some even went and volunteered to go fight for Napoleon's army. And because a lot of them started during the radical Jacobin phase, a lot of them were called Democrat clubs or Jacobin clubs. So at any rate, this scared the heck out of John Adams, right? So while this drama had been going on prior to him, George Washington had declared neutrality. Nothing says in Article 2 that a president can unilaterally declare neutrality, right? It says Congress is declare war, raise an army, and all that. Then the president takes over when a war is fought. But Washington did it anyway, and he declared that we were to stay neutral in all that drama in the old world. So John Adams he inherits that position, but he tinkers with it, right? Is the first thing he does is he begins ranting and railing about the French Navy stopping American merchant ships and naval ships and confiscating their goods because they were both sides were trying to engage in a naval blockade of one another to try to starve each other out, right? But already you don't have it codified until the 1850s with the Crimean War between Russia and Turkey, but you already had these councils and these meetings met throughout Europe from here to there, different time, different years, whereby they were laying out what had formerly been kind of collectively known as just war doctrine from the Catholic Church, in the days all the way going back to Augustine of Hippo in the 400s. And basically the two categories are you must fight for the right reasons and you must fight in the right manner once you're fighting for a war to be considered just by the Catholic Church. That's kind of been secularized by humanist leaders later on, like Hugo Grotius. And really a lot of the origins of that can be seen today in the UN and NATO. So at any rate, there were already notions of international rights during war. And that clearly was in violation of it. If you are a neutral country and you are not trading contraband, right, you have the right to trade what you want to any belligerent country, any country at war. And clearly Napoleon's Navy was violating that right. So instead of using diplomacy at first, John Adams kind of had a knee-jerk reaction and he began raising a Navy. And he had the Navy engage in a convoy system, whereby people were only allowed to leave certain ports like Charleston, Boston, etc., just 2 to 3 times a year, supposed to anyway. And they were to be basically chaperoned by the U.S. Navy to protect them. And the U.S. Navy had the authority given to them by the president to fire upon the French naval ships if the French engaged in hostile acts toward them and toward the merchant ships that they were protecting. So you had some battles, and you had lives lost on both sides, and it was known as the quasi-war, the almost war, right? And it was predominantly in the Caribbean, not on the Atlantic coast of these European countries, ironically. The liberals were furious. Okay. And so then his Congress develops a couple very controversial laws, right? That are, I would say, constitutionally dubious. They're kind of constitutionally doubtful. The Alien Act, it's clear in Article 1, Section 8, that Congress has been given the right of making decisions regarding immigration, naturalization, etc. It's in there, Article 1, Section 8. In the Alien Act, Congress handed that power over to the president. Now, remember, if you're a good liberal at that time period, the checks and balances, that which is allocated to each branch, was very deliberately, very intelligently decided upon by the founding fathers. You're not to play with it. You're not to just suddenly take a power from one branch and give it to another. So that was disconcerting to the liberals, and it gave President John Adams the power to deport any immigrant radicals. And of course, everyone knew who that was pertaining to, French radicals. Okay. Then the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act curtailed, it cut short, right? It limited our First Amendment rights. So you see here, do I have it here? So, Alien Act. The Sedition Act, okay, especially toward his rival critics in the press, writing for highly critical papers like the Aurora and the National Gazette, he had taken, okay, no, I'm defending him already at this point. Sorry. So I must have, man, I'm pretty short on explaining that one. I can't even find it. Okay, with the Sedition Act, is if in your midst of expressing yourself, if you in any way encouraged subordination against the federal government and the policies of the federal government, you were not allowed to express those things under the Sedition Act. All right. And notice in the future, you fast forward to the Carl Schenck case of World War I. This guy was telling people to burn their draft cards, don't show up for duty. If you fight against our own government and our own armed forces, not against those of Germany and the Central Powers of World War I. He was arrested. He pled his First Amendment rights, and he lost. They contended, right, in the Carl Schenck case during World War I, that if in the midst of your self-expression, you create an environment of clear and present danger, right, where you're whipping up a crowd to destroy property and to attack federal authorities, etc., that you have overstepped your First Amendment right. And of course, we have others that have added to that. So we have, you know, some big limitations to our First Amendment rights subsequent to John Adams. You have the fighting words. A guy used fighting words evidently against an off-duty cop, and the cop punched him out, and the cop won, saying that the guy provoked him to fighting words. Don't ask me how you define that. In the 1950s, there was one with a sex toy store right next to an elementary school, and they said that that was improper and had to be, you know, like stripper bars, etc. They're supposed to be a certain distance away from elementary schools and public parks that children play on, etc. And they said one of the deciding Supreme Court justices said, I don't know how to define inappropriate, but I know it when I see it. And so some of these are a bit nebulous, these restrictions we have on our First Amendment rights, but they're there nevertheless. But to do it so early as the second president, it scared a lot of Americans to put this limitation on First Amendment rights. Okay. So at any rate, he does such. But then what about his own party? At least he's got his own conservative Federalist Party to fall back on, right? Well, firstly, those two acts made by Congress, he expressed in his diary and to others, he had qualms about both of them. And he was worried about in the future presidents taking what he did and extending that line even further in a tyrannical direction. So therefore, he was very meek in carrying them out. He virtually deported no one. And he toyed with the idea of shutting down the Aurora and National Gazette on account of the Sedition Act. But even that, he tiptoed around that. So he angered the conservatives because they passed this for him in Congress and he wouldn't do anything with it. Then the conservatives also wanted him to go a step further and declare war on Napoleonic France, revolutionary France. And he didn't want to go that far. In fact, it wouldn't be the only time in American history. An educated layman went over to Europe and tried to negotiate with the French and was making some headway. And the administration of John Adams wanted him arrested for posing as an American diplomat. We had never been given authority to do such. And instead, Adams went with him, spoke with him, met with him, told him what he expected, asked him to even go back to the French and do it again. So he went out of his way to try to keep peace with revolutionary France and Napoleon, even though he had begun a quasi-war in the Caribbean. So you see, he's making enemies on both sides. Then also what didn't help is he personally disliked Alexander Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton was a powerful friend to have as a Federalist and also a powerful enemy to make as a Federalist. He called Alexander Hamilton the vain peacock, said everything he did was for his own aggrandizement, his own reputation, his own fame, and he just didn't like him personally. And so before it didn't take long, and he was getting the political opposition from his own alleged ally, Alexander Hamilton. And then Fry's Rebellion happened, and there was a rally, and then about 2/3 through it, the crowd turned violent, and it killed some police officers. They took the man who was speaking, and because they couldn't find who had done the killing, and they wanted him to be executed, the conservatives, to make a statement to the rest of the country that rebellion would not be tolerated. And President John Adams pardoned him. He had been a lawyer himself. Remember, he's part of the War for Independence, the rebellion against Great Britain. But just in the midst of all that drama, he defended the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre, said that they were provoked into firing back at the crowd. So this guy was a stickler for details as a lawyer and said, no, John Fries did nothing to incite the crowd to do that, and I'm not going to punish him for it. And then also, he was an abolitionist, and he recognized Haiti. And remember with Haiti, Toussaint Louverture, I'm probably butchering that name, this had become known as a Black slaves rebellion, and hence a Black slave republic on the island of Haiti against the French, their colonizers. And not to mention, their official religion initially was Vodun, where we get the term voodoo. So this scared the heck out of the South and many people, many conservatives. And John Adams was ahead of his time in that respect and said, they're human beings who have been enslaved. They fought valiantly for their freedom. I recognize them. So he made enemies on both sides. And therefore he said, McCulloch, that he suffered for that virtue by losing re-election. Any questions about that with John Adams, our second president? All right, moving on to number 3. I'm going to be a little shorter on this one. I'm going to try to. I don't know how well I wrote this. This is kind of cheesy. I'm writing from the first person as if I'm Thomas Jefferson, and I'm getting it from a book called American Political Tradition by Richard Hofstadter. All right, and he doesn't presume to do this. He writes in the third person. But what's so cool about this book, American Political Tradition, he has an American leader in each chapter, a different one, and he gives a psychological take on them. And for the momentum of psychology in the 1950s, right? They'd obviously had Freud long before then, and other big names, Carl Jung and so forth. But that's still, to me, it's amazing that he did this in the 50s. And I don't know, I just thought it was very, very interesting. Is he gives a mom and dad thesis about Thomas Jefferson. He paints this picture of a very non-confrontational, inwardly troubled kid in the person of Thomas Jefferson, who grows up in a tense environment between his dad and his mother's parents. His mother was a Randolph. He, almost alone amongst the founding fathers, had such a direct tie to high aristocracy in Scotland and England through his mom, that he could have been handpicked on Virginia's Royal Council, not just elected as an assemblyman, like a common American colonist. He could have been like a British councilman by virtue of his mom and her name. And of course, he chose not to. He wanted to run for office like any colonist instead. But supposedly, his mom's parents never ceased, and his mother for that matter in this chapter, never ceased to put on airs, to feel a sense of superiority and feel a sense of entitlement because of their last name and because of their royal bloodline. Consequently, they never forgave their son-in-law, Thomas Jefferson's dad, a commoner named Peter Jefferson. They never forgave him for marrying their daughter, because under the English laws of coverture, her legal identity, her property, her wealth, etc., are literally covered. They're literally taken over by her wedded husband. So supposedly the dad tried to make peace by telling them, you don't need to leave your palatial home. I'll just move in with the rest of you guys. We'll coexist. But supposedly it was stressful for young Thomas Jefferson. So on more than one occasion, he tries to go out and do farm work with his dad. And his dad tells him, supposedly more than once, no, son, I won't allow it. Use that family name of your mother's to get the best education, to get the best life, and to get as high as you can. So he becomes a young man of leisure. He doesn't have to work with his hands. He gets the best of European tutors. He goes to France to further his education, etc., right? And has this somewhat aristocratic lifestyle. But he reads in the Enlightenment everything against that old world hegemony, that old world and that class's domination of the aristocracy, of the nobility, saying, why in the world should they get this and should they get that? There should be equality of opportunity for all people, et cetera, et cetera. So he must have become very, very, incrementally uncomfortable, for lack of a better word, with his upbringing and his wealthy mom. So what he's implying, which I think you could easily get, is that Thomas Jefferson decided to take on a persona of being a man of the common people, being a Democrat. That yes, he admitted to John Adams that he thought his present generation would the common people would get a lot wrong. But he said democracy would have been a lesser evil than an aristocracy, because he said he disagreed with the Greeks that education equates to virtue, that he thinks the wrong and rash decisions made by the commoners, but made in ignorance, made in innocence, would not be as detrimental to the republic as the wrong, morally wrong decisions made by well-read, leisurely, educated aristocrats who knew exactly the right and wrong thing to do, but simply chose the wrong thing to do morally. He also said that he believed the common people had sagacity, Sagacity. Sagacity is like street smarts, common sense, a basic knowledge of morality, of right and wrong, good and evil, etc. And he said, all you have to do is add to that by having a, quote, crusade against ignorance, having basically a program for public education. And he said that there are no boundaries to what the people can do in the future. So to Richard Hofstadter, who wrote about him in this book, he says that there was wealth guilt involved. There was a desire to please and impress his commoner dad. There was an empathy for his dad and the common people that he didn't have the courage to articulate to his mom and grandparents. And so that almost when he becomes president, he almost becomes this passive aggressive man of the people. So supposedly when he became president, he was known to invite poor neighbors, because there were some very poverty-stricken people in that area of Washington, D.C. He supposedly had an old widowed woman who loved her tomato patch and had almost nothing. And he would very often invite her to these formal parties at the White House, along with these dignitaries, these high-ranking people from Europe and others coming to visit the president. And he says that he oftentimes would give them the cold shoulder and instead give most of his attention and affection to that old lady. And so to him, it's all tied to his childhood. He was secretly angry with his mom, disgusted with her sense of superiority and entitlement, as well as his grandparents, hated the way they mistreated his dad. He felt guilty about being associated with them, and he was trying to compensate. And long after his dad, Peter Jefferson, died, he was still trying to impress his dad. Pretty interesting, huh? So that's number 3. That's Hofstadter's thesis. And then finally here with the great man history is number 4. Is this contends Jefferson felt compelled by circumstances beyond his control to violate his own rhetoric. So you have Thomas Jefferson, you have William McKinley, and you have Woodrow Wilson. Those 3 presidents, more than others, said one thing, but did another. Their actions seem to completely violate and contradict their rhetoric, what they claim they stood for. Okay? So you could say the common theses, right, are that power changes people. They became more conservative as they aged, and those types of things, right? But not Brinkley. Brinkley, it's equally simple, as Brinkley just says, this guy, every time he sensed irresistible opposition, he folded. He folded. And instead of adhering to what he had once proclaimed, he became, instead of an idealist who wanted to improve the world, like in his young days, in his writings, he became merely a pragmatist. And remember, a pragmatist doesn't care necessarily about right or wrong, doesn't care necessarily about liberal or conservative, enlightened or pragmatic or so forth. He just cares about making the practical oriented decision that yields the best immediate and or long-term benefits for the country, no matter if that decision happens to be liberal or conservative, etc. All right. So you could almost picture Thomas Jefferson saying that, as well as Woodrow Wilson later on in World War I, is, hey, it's easy to be consistent ideologically when you're an intellectual writer, right? You just proofread, look at what you've written in the past, make sure you stay consistent with that, etc. But it's a whole other ballgame when you find yourself in these huge dilemmas trying to lead a country, lead a republic. And there's so much to lose, and there's so many facets and sides to the situation, etc., that it's nearly impossible to stay idealistic, that you almost have to become pragmatic and just make the practical decisions. All right. So some of those examples, the one that's most salient, that stands out the most to me, there are kind of two. One is slavery. When he wrote his version of the Declaration of Independence, he wrote a scathing denunciation of slavery, and the other founding fathers scratched it out of the Declaration for obvious reasons. They didn't want to alienate the Southern reps. But he also had communication with a French friend, and the French friend loved to pick his brain because he knew how well read Thomas Jefferson was. And he would ask him, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And Thomas Jefferson would kind of pontificate, right? He would almost kind of preach on that given topic and then move to another. Well, Madison and his friends were so impressed with the contents of this correspondence that some say they did it unbeknownst to Jefferson, but he didn't seem to be too angry when it happened. They grabbed these letters and they amalgamated all of it together into a book. And it's called Notes on the State of Virginia by Thomas Jefferson. So in that, he writes about how immoral, archaic, tyrannical, self-destructive, economically just hurtful slavery is, right? And he also says that it ruins the moral fiber of both parties. He says with the masters, they get an unrealistic sense of self-importance, and they become their own little tyrannical emperors and kings on their plantations. They think they can get away with anything. They expect everyone around them to defer to them like they're the king. They're not, they don't ever have to compromise, et cetera, right? And it ends up ruining their character. But he says also the slaves, he says, as long as they're put in the position in which, under the slave codes, they have virtual little, if any, few, if any choices, right? That everything they do is under duress. And therefore, they're going to become survivors. And they're going to do everything they can, moral or immoral, to cope, to survive, to maybe even gain their manumission, their freedom, etc. And so therefore he called it, they become sycophants. And a sycophant, right, are like the people that hang around the king or emperor at the court, and they kiss up to him, and they try to curry favor with him. And oftentimes, when there have been coups to overthrow the kings, they've been a part of it. They can't be trusted because, again, they're at the mercy of the king. So, of course, they're always going to tell him what he wants to hear, etc. And they're going to have their own secret agendas. So he says it ruins, and also it can lead to hopelessness for the slaves. So they'll turn to vice, anything they can for escape, etc., etc. So it ruins both parties, he said. And he said the perfect example of the delusion of the slave masters is for the slave master to take one of his female slaves as a paramour, as a lover. Because, of course, what is she really going to do? What is she really going to say? Etc. Well, at Monticello, he inherited from his mother and then also from his wealthy wife, at any given time, more than like 400 slaves. By the time he died, they were like 160 something. But at any rate, he gets all these slaves at Monticello, and he never frees them. In fact, he doesn't even free them at his death, but he gives them over to his eldest daughter. Okay. So it's like, what the heck? Then he also takes a paramour in the person of Sally Hemings. And she eventually, like the third time he takes her to Paris, she gives him an ultimatum that she's not getting back on the boat and leaving France until he promises that their shared biracial children will be emancipated, will be freed. And only under duress like that does he promise to free them. Okay, so that's strange. Okay. So at any rate, you have that. And of course, right, when you look at Thomas Jefferson himself, he contends that he led his slaves benevolently. He worked with them with his hands. And I guess that's true. Their oldest son, his oldest son with Sally Hemings, was a boy named Beverly. When Beverly came of age at 18, he expected and had been promised to have his freedom. He wanted to get out of there. He had a strained relationship with his father, Thomas Jefferson. And the news of their affair had just come out. So Thomas Jefferson tells his eldest son with her, Beverly, I'm sorry, we're going to have to wait until the storm dies down. So Beverly just ran away, and we don't know of them seeing each other again. His youngest with her was a boy named Eston. They said it in looks, in mannerisms, in tastes, that he was just like his dad, but just darker skin. And that they had a great rapport, seemingly, with each other. But when his time went to be freed, he left. They supposedly both wept and embraced each other, but he left, and we don't know of them communicating after that. And then they had a daughter, and shame on me for forgetting her name. But his eldest daughter, she had with his widowed prior wife. I don't remember if he had one or two daughters with her, but one of them, the first or second, obviously it'd be the second if they had two. The mother died in childbirth, and so she supposedly her whole life was very fragile. She supposedly married an abusive husband. Thomas Jefferson tried for years to get her to leave him and to come back to Monticello with him. So eventually she does. But when she comes, she'd had him a granddaughter with that abusive ex-husband. Well, she and the granddaughter immediately felt competitive with his lover, with her father's lover, Sally Hemings, and Sally Hemings' daughter, biracial daughter, with him. And supposedly they treated the two of them horribly. And Jefferson wanted nothing to do with it, did not want to get in the middle of it, and did little, if nothing, to help stem the abuse. All right. So then moving on to another example, and that is the Louisiana Purchase, right? In 1803, we bought a huge swath of land from Napoleonic France. And shame on me, which I didn't, for not having a map of that Louisiana territory purchase. But at any rate, it's going to involve over 20 future states and territories. Supposedly it was a great deal even for them, less than 2 cents an acre, something like that. But nowhere in the Constitution does it say that in Article 2 that the president can do that. But he had his men do it anyway. His argument was, he said, look at Napoleon's invasion of France. Supposedly it was almost improvisational. He said Napoleon is mercurial. Mercurial is like, today we would say, like bipolar. This guy is just erratic emotionally. You never know what he's going to do. He is a potentially dangerous man. And he didn't want all that territory owned by a potential enemy that powerful along our Mississippi River. And then secondly, of course, is he wanted to be able to afford cheap, affordable land to his poor white voters. So he says, sorry, I can't. Let's treat it in the form of a treaty. Ask the Senate to approve it for me. We'll do it kind of backwards in order. And he said, future generations will forgive me because of the benefits of it. But he sends Lewis and Clark. And I know this is a simple dichotomy. And anytime you do that, you're taking away the real complexity of it. But I'm going to do it anyway, and I apologize. Is in some ways, Meriwether Lewis was the epitome of Jefferson's intellectual curiosity. That which he wrote down, that which he gathered, really demonstrated Jefferson's genuine curiosity about the land he was buying. So the flora and fauna, right? The animal and plant life. He brought back part of the head of a mastodon that they had excavated from underground. And Jefferson was just crazy over that. Just all these curiosities, right? Meriwether brought back, and Jefferson kept himself very busy studying such for quite some time. But Clark, right? Clark and his writings and his speeches, etc., he seemed to be more like a military spy. He wrote down the types of tribes that they encountered, their rough numbers, how many able-bodied fighting men they had, what types of goods they might be enticed by, if the U.S. was likely to have to eventually fight them or not, etc. That was noted often by Clark. And yes, it is true that they had a guy named Narbonneau as their French and Indian scout. And his wife, Sacagawea, was much more useful than he was. And in fact, they did get caught across the Sierra Nevada by the Shoshone tribe. We have every reason to believe that the Shoshone were deliberating whether or not to have them killed. And one of the leaders happened to be the brother of Sacagawea, and she got them off. So at any rate, he does that. Then he finds in the Louisiana Territory that there are all these tribes, much greater in number than he had anticipated. Also that in the southern section, there was a curious combination of Cajuns and Creoles. The Cajuns, originally transplanted from France to Arcadia in Canada, and they'd had one too many rebellions and been forcefully transplanted down to New Orleans. So they had a reputation for rebelliousness, for being kind of libertarian, not wanting any type of government telling them what to do. The Creoles, they were pre-French Revolution. They expected to rule. They expected people to have the proper papers to do things economically. They were old school aristocrats and not accustomed to democratic government. So on account of those demographics, then in addition to that, you had a guy named Wilkerson, and he and Aaron Burr, the same Aaron Burr that killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel, they were part of they were exonerated, but there is evidence that suggests that they really were guilty. They were making overtures to foreign governments to sell that land we were just now buying, the Louisiana Territory. So they're engaged in kind of a treasonous act. And there was a big publicized trial, but somehow they got off. So at any rate, with all that in context, Mr. Democrat, Thomas Jefferson, said that Louisiana vast territory, we just bought it, but I'm not about to do anything to jeopardize losing it. So he said, I'm putting military over there and I'm putting hand-picked governors. So he had a royal council of 21 men in the north and 21 men in the south with armed forces. He said, the people there aren't ready to democratically participate in government. I don't trust them. So he didn't adhere to his democratic principles once after he'd made the unilateral decision to buy Louisiana when the Constitution didn't say he could, after he sent Clark, arguably, on a spy tour, a military spy tour. He then put a hand-picked, undemocratic government over the Louisiana territory. For now, he said. So you see how one thing after another, he didn't come through with his radical rhetoric from before. He hated Hamilton's system, called it plutocratic, right? And he puts in a rather enlightened French Secretary of Treasury. Oh gosh, what was his name? His name's eluding me right now. But at any rate, hopefully it'll come to me in a minute. But this gentleman does a tour, comes back and says, Mr. President, there are too many loans out to too many industries, to too many businesses, etc. We cannot just kill Hamilton's bank and kill his system. It's too integrated into our economy. So Jefferson let it be. And people thought for sure he was going to attack that system. And then one more is the Barbary Coast War. Is the Barbary Coast pirates of Tripoli had a system of extortion, whereby they would have their corsairs. And from what I understand, a corsair is just an official paid pirate. Had their corsairs venture throughout the Mediterranean from the Tripoli coast of North Africa, and capture people, take their loot, and sell and hold the captured people for ransom to make money off of. And then ultimately, if they didn't get the ransom they wanted, they would sell them into the market of Istanbul, and that was supposedly like hell, being sold as a white European slave in Istanbul. So word gets out, the press is covering this and so forth. Thomas Jefferson has just had enough, and he sends the USS Philadelphia to go punish them. Well, it lands on, it gets stuck under the rudder in shallow water, can't move, and the men are taken as hostages, almost 50 of them. And of course, they demanded a ransom for them. So at that time, he sends a guy named William Eaton to go and find the younger brother of this guy named Yusuf Karamanli, his brother Saeed, and to get Saeed to take over for Yusuf and end the slave trade. Well, the coup attempt fails, and by this time, Congress finds out about it. And they're like, excuse me, you sent to Philadelphia, you got these men tricked and trapped, and now we're in this dilemma. Congress is to declare war. Congress is to raise an army. You're not supposed to unilaterally make these decisions as president. So Congress was furious with him. And they gave him not a declaration of war, but a limited blank check to get them out. So they sent more naval frigates. They had a few more battles, and they eventually ended up paying money to get them in. And it was known as the Barbary Coast War. And it's ironic, right? Because in the Declaration of Independence, in order to show what a tyrant George III had been of England, Thomas Jefferson wrote that over his own ego, right, his own wounded pride, he'll send men to foreign lands to fight and die for no real purpose, etc. And to his opponents and others, they thought that's exactly what Jefferson was doing on the north coast of Tripoli. So at any rate, in one case after another, he violated his own rhetoric. But he doesn't say he's a hypocrite. He doesn't say that he changed necessarily. He just said because of the circumstances, the surrounding context of each case, that they were, that he became pragmatic and no longer idealistic, but always trying to make what he thought was the practical, beneficial decision. Then 5 and 6 are on slavery. All right. With 5, Fogel and Ingerman. Boy, you got to hand it to him with courage. This was written, I believe, in the 70s, right after the Civil Rights Movement. And Fogel and Ingerman wrote a book called Time on the Cross, in which they stated that slaves were not their material. They, at least, you got to give them credit, they didn't want to touch the realm of like human psychology, emotion, and those types of things. But they said materially, food, drink, medical care, protection from brutality, physical brutality, etc. He said slaves, because they were such expensive investments, that their material lives were not that bad. That it was always in the economic best interest of the slave owners to keep them healthy, to keep them working, to keep them from rebelling, etc. Well, I clearly go against that in number 5. And maybe my evidence is a little weak, is most of my evidence is, and I don't think it's weak because the argument is weak. I just think I haven't found good enough evidence. I didn't marshal good enough evidence to give this thesis its true justice. But at any rate, for one, right, it's kind of an indirect argument, is there's so much evidence of discontent. And so in a roundabout way, I'm trying to use that to prove, how were their material lives so good? If they were always running away, secretly hunting at night and risking their lives, and to them it was worth it because they were so starving. If they were so well taken care of, supposedly, why would they go to such great levels of running away, rebelling, showing other signs of discontent, if that were the case? Then, of course, they've excavated bones. They found evidence of just brutal labor to their hips and their shoulders, because yes, they know the difference between an internal and external source of abrasion to the bone. They have evidence of malnutrition amongst the kids, and the list goes on and on. So clearly they were not well taken care of. Right there, slave William Grimes articulated their desperation. We used to steal meat whenever we could get a chance, and such was my craving for it, that if the punishment had been death, I could not have resisted the temptation. Quoting George Washington, historian Alan Taylor contends that masters often sought to feed their slaves the minimum necessary to keep them healthy and working, and not one bit more. Nocturnal events allowed to let off steam. The degree of advertisements in newspapers for runaway slaves to be returned to them. And oftentimes, your second time being caught off the plantation without the proper papers, you could be killed. Why would they risk that if their material lives were not that bad? And then you have armed insurrection, and you can look at that. Philip Fithian stated that he slept in fear of the slaves' retaliation. A traveler to the South, Jesse Torrey, noted that a master he visited made an unusual number of safeguards in locking himself up in his bedroom with an axe beside his bed for protection from his own slaves. Enough instances of slaves poisoning their masters came to light to elicit the legislator's enactment of severe punishment for poisoning. Duncan Skinner was known for almost daily whipping slaves and was found murdered. Oftentimes, masters used the poor hired white people in their region as the overseers, gave them a sense of power they've never have anywhere else. But their pay was oftentimes contingent upon the production of the slaves. So they were almost systematically set up to become the hated middleman, to be ruthless and to be scary and to try to incite through fear the slaves' utmost work production. And it states that when things came to such a climax between them and the slaves, masters were oftentimes shrewd enough to say, you know what, I better fire that overseer, blame everything on him, and tell him everything's going to be okay. I'll get a new overseer. So why all this defiance at the risk of such draconian punishments if slaves' conditions were not that bad? All right. And then the last one, slaves and the alleged utility of religious instruction. What I did is very similar to my Spanish missions, a mixed bag. If you go back to the Black legend in the Spanish colonization of the Americas, if you may recall, is I did a little bit of everything. It's a very watered down thesis, but I wanted to show, I wanted to teach that there's evidence for all the above. So you see, at first, with the Anglican authorities in the 1600s, they wanted to send missionaries to the plantations and convert these African slaves. They were Igbo, Yoruba, Dahomey, Asante, all these different tribes with their own religions, etc., right? And of course, they argued, the Anglicans, that it was the Christian thing to do, the least they could do in enslaving people, right? The notion that they were saving their souls after death. And so at any rate, they were told, however, by the planters that the planters had great qualm about this. They were worried about the insurrectionary power of the religion. So, for instance, no one preached from the book of Acts when Peter was arrogant about being Jewish with God, and God gave him a vision telling him that he accepts people from all nations, of all colors, etc. You're not going to hear that in the South, that from the book of Acts. The Anglican missionaries had to, I kid you not, they had to extract the book of Exodus from their Bibles before they went to the plantations. And as you may know, the book of Exodus, God sees the suffering of the Hebrew people under the Pharaoh as his slaves, and he frees them. He does all these miracles to free them from their oppressor. So they did not want slaves to hear that, right? So hence, you had this great fear that Christianity would have this empowering effect on the slaves, and it could be trouble for the slave owners. So they were very deliberate and calculated in their conversion, and very hesitant in their conversion of slaves in the 1600s. But then, also the year of Jubilee, where they're told that a certain key years, after a certain number of years, what is it, 70 years, they're to release and give freedom to all slaves, etc. in the Old Testament. But then look what changes by the antebellum period. And this is more of an interpretation that we're familiar with today because of the role of Karl Marx in academia. You will find that an hour devoted every Sabbath morning to their moral and religious instruction would prove a great aid to you in bringing about a better state of things amongst the, quote, Negroes. The effect upon their general good behavior, their cleanliness and good conduct on the Sabbath, is such as alone to recommend it to the planter and his overseer. So, of course, with Marxists, right, they'll make the contention that is stuck to this day with some, that religion is an opiate, right? Religion is a nice Vicodin pill to make them just be able to cope, to feel a sense of comfort so that they won't rebel, and that they'll just wait for death in heaven and for God to judge people after death and not do anything rebelliously now. So you had that as a sentiment in the antebellum period, in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, etc. And some swore by that. So my point being is that there was a little bit of all the above. There's evidence that some slaves absolutely felt a sense of dignity, felt a sense of worth, felt a sense of, in a positive way, entitlement. Some slaves took it further and turned it into rebellion, and that the Christian God will righteously help our cause in rebellion. That did happen. There's evidence of that. You also have a lot of evidence of slaves saying that religion kept things just precariously in control, that they literally still had murderous and rebellious thoughts and feelings, but religion empowered them to overcome those feelings and hold them at bay and simply cope. And then you have other cases of the proverbial Uncle Toms, who began to just be filled with love, obedience, and it sadly worked better for the planters, and then becoming more reliable, faithful, docile, etc. There's evidence of all of it. All right, so does anybody have any questions on any of these? This is one of the longest ones we'll have. All right. If it's not too much to ask, could I ask for a thumbs up or two? You guys feel like you got a decent command over this stuff? You're somewhat ready to do it? Thank you, Miguel. Thank you. All right. Before I leave, are there any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself if you do. All right. Okay, guys. So after an hour and 35 minutes, 40 minutes, I'm probably going to finally bid you adieu, okay? Thank you. You guys be well. Hang in there, okay?
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Miguel. You take care.
Sir.
Abner, thank you.